It pulls you in and doesn't let go.
Okay, hello, welcome to the Carousel. We have with us today John Lechner, who is an adventurer and a journalist who has recently published, I believe in March, a book about Wagner, which is the private military group in Russia that we've all heard quite a bit about, I think. It's called Death is Our Business. Russian mercenaries in the new era of private warfare, which looks really, really fascinating. So, welcome, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, appreciate it.
Okay, so tell us, how did this become your beat? How did you start getting involved with the private military groups?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, honestly, kind of at the center of what I always kind of my true passion is probably actually languages and linguistics. And I had spent some time living in Russia before going to college, was a Russian studies guy. Spent about 7 years after that as an investment banker, thinking I could somehow, square my interest in these languages and cultures and history with finance, and then finally admitted to myself that I could not. And I had been traveling quite a bit in Africa at that time, and had moved down to DC. And so uh, when kind of articles first started coming out about this Russian private military company, PMC Wagner Group, showing up in the Central African Republic, for me, this was just like the confluence of so many of my interests, in terms of Africa, in terms of Russia. I speak Russian fluently, speak French, and so I knew I just wanted to be there. And so I first traveled to Central African Republic, or CAR, in 2019, which was about a year into when the Russians first started arriving, and was quickly just fascinated by the country itself. Ended up covering the conflict there for about 5 years, traveling throughout rural CAR to all parts of the country, interviewing not just Wagner mercenaries and commanders, but also the armed group leaders who were fighting against them, civilians. And so I knew that there was a book to be written about this, because sort of what you see on the ground was not reflective necessarily of the kind of like exaggerated type of headlines that you'll see in major media. And then the book itself became, a history of Wagner Group more generally. And so it took me to Mali, both sides of the Libyan conflict, Syria. I was back in Ukraine, was on the front lines there for the book, and so it was a real effort to make it much more of sort of an oral history. I interviewed about around 40 guys in Wagner for the book, and then hundreds more folks who were fighting against them, or the civilians caught in between. And I guess now, because of that, I sort of am on the PMC or private warfare beat, because that is certainly an aspect of it. And I mean, we could get into it, but it's definitely one that is, only growing kind of in prominence, not just in Russia, but around the world too.
So, how dangerous was this in car when you were there? Were you, having bullets whizzing by your head, or yeah, what was it like?
In car, I mean, look, car's dangerous. I mean, it's all red zone if you go by, the State Department and stuff. So, I mean, there's not a lot of state presence, right? And so a lot of it is kind of ruled by armed groups. And so, I've traveled through armed group territory over there. Um, I mean, I kind of look like a dude in Wagner, so that sort of like helps in some ways, but it also, will elicit curiosity in others that like might not always be as helpful. But I mean, anything can happen in college. And once you're outside the capital, I mean, it is the Wild West out there. And a lot of folks just disappear. It's the size of Texas. I mean, it's very kind of lightly controlled by the state, if at all. So, but that doesn't mean that there aren't these other forms, these other forms of governance that exist, even if the state isn't quite there. Um, and I can still blend in with like humanitarians who are operating in the country because in all of these conflict zones, there's usually a humanitarian infrastructure, um, and uh, and two, like in any given conflict, you rarely kind of, especially in car, it's sort of like these ambushes, kind of attacks at night can happen in all different sorts of places. It's not a very populated. It's only 5 million people living in a country the size of Texas, and so you kind of would have to have like bad luck to be in the village that gets attacked, at a certain point in time. And so there were never really bullets whizzing by my head in car. Um, Mali and frontline Ukraine are much more dangerous, I think.
Oh yeah.
So just like, and I was disappeared in Mali, so I was blindfolded and shuttled away and taken to a black site for a couple of days and went missing, and my family had to deal with that whole thing. Yeah.
Why?
So they just suspected me of being a spy, and and they snatched me, and my family thought, I mean, because like the FBI calls, basically, and is like, and of course they don't know, like, they're well, I mean, they probably have some folks who are familiar with Mali, but I mean, they basically were telling my family like, you'll be lucky if this is Al Qaeda, and so everyone is freaking out. But I eventually got out after like another whole kind of incident. But
How'd
and
you
then
get out?
my wife actually, because she knew that I am just like such a Luddite when it comes to technology, that when I had left, I had just gotten a new iPhone, and it would never occur to me to like delete all of my info from the old iPhone. And so she went up into uh, the basically this room, and she found my old iPhone, figured out the combination to get into it from my sister's, because she knew it was like some version of my home phone number, like when you're a little kid, and got in and then pinged my new iPhone, which was with the Malian security at the black site. And so then when certain folks in a certain government passed that information along, the Malians panicked and decided to get rid of me. And so then they blindfolded me again. And this was all unbeknownst to me, but it was the only time that it was like a little bit where it felt kind of hairy to me was because I knew I was with the government fairly early on. Like at first, when you get blindfolded, you're like, "Oh shit! I really hope this isn't ISIS or Al Qaeda."
Right.
But then very quickly it was like clear that this was the government. Um, but they blindfolded me again in the middle of the night. They rushed me into a car, and then I knew that we weren't too far away from where they picked me up at my hotel, from just the distance that we drove um, on the way there. But then they started driving around for like an hour, and I'm blindfolded, so I don't know where we are, and then they stop and they do a vehicle transfer. So they pull me out of one vehicle and put me into another. And at that moment, I was like, oh, maybe this is like going in a different direction than I thought it was going to go. Um, but then eventually they took off the blindfold, and I was back at my hotel with, U.S. government folks there, signed me over, and I was out. So it was thanks to my wife. So that was one of the hairier things, and then um, obviously frontline Ukraine is a very different type of danger. Uh, Syria too, kind of right before Assad fell, you have ISIS 2.0. So again, it's sort of like it's less of a getting caught in a shootout. Same in Mali too, and it's more if you stick around in an area for too long, you're at kidnap risk for sure.
Yeah. So let's start from the beginning with Wagner. So what is Wagner? How did it come to be?
So it's a you have what's interesting about Wagner is you have to kind of understand a bit about kind of how Russia works, especially under Putin, to understand how this thing came about. And so, in the book, I talk about sort of Wagner's place within the global trends in the privatization of warfare. And so, this is something that this sort of PMC model is not something that the Russians invented. They were watching as well. Um, America's use of private contractors, especially in the war on terror, the Blackwaters of the world. They even had, coming out of the Somali piracy crisis in the 2010s, there were sort of a number of what we would call like Western style PMCs that popped up in Russia, where the guys were mostly just kind of guarding ships that were going through the Gulf of Aden to protect against Somali pirates. But those companies had an issue because mercenarism itself was illegal in Russia, and that's a legacy of sort of the chaotic 1990s during the after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you had almost these sort of kind of private armies develop underneath these various gangsters and oligarchs. And so, for obvious reasons, kind of you can't have mercenaries domestically. And so the companies would sort of get around this at the time by, the big joke was that they were tourists, because they would essentially, the companies themselves would be registered in the Bahamas or Hong Kong or whatever, and the Russians who were contractors would fly first from St. Petersburg or Moscow to London, and then from London they would go down to Egypt, where they would get equipped or whatever, and then get on the ship. And then when they returned, they would return via London. And so whenever the Russian customs officer was asking where they were, they would just say, oh, I was in the UK for tourism. And that sort of kind of continued until the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014, where the Kremlin made the decision to seize and annex Crimea, and in order to do so, they leveraged a lot of sort of these kind of like ultra nationalists, these Cossack groups, kind of soccer hooligans, these types of even Russian neo Nazis, and these guys to kind of go down to Crimea and provide like a bit of muscle. And because they were just kind of normal ish dudes, kind of a degree of like local cover for what was essentially a Russian special forces operation. Um, and obviously the annexation kind of went without kind of tremendous difficulty, and the Kremlin thought that they could basically send these guys home. But that annexation kicked off a chain of events in eastern Ukraine as well, especially in Donbass, where pro-Russian separatists began taking over administrative buildings as well, and they started expecting that the Russian state would be not far behind to support them, just like they felt that they saw in Crimea, and those movements were also attracting Russian nationalists from Russia who were coming to volunteer to offer their support, and that put the Kremlin in sort of a bind, especially Vladimir Putin at the time, because um, only 2 years earlier in 2012, when he was returning to the presidency, there were mass protests against his return. And one of the key components, the component that he very much feared, was that a lot of the Russian nationalists were marching against him. They felt that he had the Russian Federation was sort of a bastard version of what Greater Russia was supposed to be, whether it was Orthodox Tsarist or kind of a more kind of ethnic pagan Russian state. But they were basically against the Russian Federation and against Putin as the head of it. And they used these guys in Crimea because these guys naturally supported Crimea, but they also didn't have full control over them. And it put Putin in a bind when the Ukrainian state started going in to retake the territory of Donbass from these pro-Russian separatists. That the Russians didn't want to annex these regions at the time, like Crimea. There was no need for them. They didn't have like a great cultural kind of historical importance in the same way that Crimea did. But Putin couldn't be seen as kind of letting these Russian nationalists hang out to dry. So they had to support them and not support them at the same time. And so they chose this kind of very ad hoc way of doing so. And one of the measures that they turned to was using quote unquote, mercenaries, which brought together, in the case of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who we can go into his history, but he was basically a St. Petersburg gangster who became a restaurateur to the Russian elite, who eventually leveraged those connections to get the major contracts from the Russian state to provide meals to the Russian military and school system, and a former Russian military intelligence officer, Dmitry Utkin. They came together to provide, at the time, it was only probably about 50, at the earliest stages, like 50 to 100 guys to go into eastern Ukraine and help support the pro-Russian separatists. And then over time, their mission actually became to assassinate and take out some of the kind of pro-Russian separatists who were not fitting into kind of the centralization, the structures of the Russian state as they kind of formally started to take over things in eastern Ukraine.
So his name, the founder, is Prigozhin. Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he is no longer with us, correct?
He is no longer with us. Yeah,
if I remember correctly, because he for a moment there, it looked like he was going to go against Putin, right? And then he retracted, and then I guess you don't last long after doing that.
Yeah, Prigozhin is obviously very kind of central to the book. I mean, he's a fascinating character. Uh, like I said, he sort of came from the wrong side of the tracks in the Soviet Union. Ended up going away to prison for about 8 years. He was part of a kind of a street gang in St. Petersburg, and they assaulted and robbed a woman. Um, and Prigozhin was responsible for nearly killing her. And he goes away, and when he gets out of prison, the Soviet Union is sort of collapsing around him, and he returns to St. Petersburg, gets involved with kind of a number of St. Petersburg gangsters. They set him up first as a manager of a grocery store chain, and then he eventually becomes the owner of two kind of very famous restaurants that, like I said, were catering to the Russian elite and were frequented as well by kind of a younger Vladimir Putin. And quite famously, when Putin became president and when George Bush visited, I think 2 times he actually ate at Prigozhin's restaurant. And there are these photos of Prigozhin serving the food to George Bush.
Wow.
And but I mean, he was a guy who absolutely had a chip on his shoulder, right? Like he still, I mean, like, I don't want to like exoticize Russia kind of all the time, because you'll say like, oh, in Russia, like, there's a stigma about going away to jail for 8 years, and it's like, well, yeah, so it's kind of here too. Like, it becomes tougher to get a job. It's and but like, there's obviously a stigma attached with being sort of a gangster, right? That folks in kind of polite society don't necessarily take to, and so Prigozhin definitely was that. But I think for Putin, sort of that gangster side of Prigozhin was kind of refreshing, or he liked kind of the way that he worked, and so he kind of set him up to get these catering contracts for the Russian military and for schools, and that's really how he made his money. But the way in which Russia operates, which is important to understand in terms of how Wagner operated, is it's at this time, it's coming out of the fall of the Soviet Union. Under Putin, the Russian state is kind of strong again following the 90s under Yeltsin, and it has these kind of outsized ambitions on the world stage, but they still have a limited means in budget to do so. And so one of the ways that the oligarchs and those who have very much benefited from Putin's regime can sort of virtue signal is to show that they back Putin, that they back Russia, is they fill in some of these budgetary gaps, or they go out and they kind of finance these quote unquote patriotic initiatives that further Putin's rule or the Russian state. And Prigozhin was an expert at this. So, he gets the catering contract, and, what does he do? He goes out and he finances this documentary in 2012 that calls protests and the protesters into question, right? The guys who were marching against Putin. He's always trying to do these like little favors,
Okay.
show like,
Interesting.
hey, this is why I'm your guy, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's
And
the maitre d. It's the maitre d approach.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, that's sort of how the system works. Like, you put in a little bit and you hope to get rewarded on the other end.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and so when uh, the uh, the war in Ukraine was breaking out, a lot of kind of these oligarchs would step in and sort of provide the funding or provide the political cover. But basically, in Russia, it's called kind of sponsorship for these different structures to operate. And so Prigozhin essentially, became the sponsor for uh, Dmitry Utkin and Wagner Group. Uh, after there was a ceasefire in 2015, a lot of those groups had just sort of disbanded. But Prigozhin, again, he's someone who's always kind of thinking about the next thing. He's very much for lack of a better term, he's like a deal guy. Like, he loves the transaction itself. He loves, like, money and power is important to him, but it's sort of a byproduct of going and chasing after kind of the next big thing and moving up within Putin's regime as well. And so he has these mercenaries now at his disposal, right? And he's like, what do I do with them? And luckily for him, a few months later, Russia overtly intervenes in the Syrian conflict on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, and Prigozhin basically lobbies to get his guys into it. He's successful. Then the Ministry of Defense kicks him out again, and then he gets him back in. And from there, from Syria, they're off doing things in Africa, and especially in Africa, a lot of it is ultimately getting financed by Prigozhin himself in the hopes of making long-term returns, but also as a way, again, of sort of showing Putin his value, right? And why he is more valuable than his own kind of internal enemies within the regime. And ultimately, all of those types of kind of enmity and trends kind of come together in Ukraine and ultimately explode when Prigozhin doesn't really mutiny, but he decides to use Wagner to capture his main rival, the Minister of Defense, and the goal was to the Minister of Defense was at the time Sergei Shoigu, and the goal was essentially to capture and kill Shoigu, and become, I suppose, the Minister of Defense, or to install, someone who is more favorable to himself. And like you said, ultimately, he failed in that, and then it led to his demise.
Okay, so, but why did he think that that was a good idea? Like, didn't he know that that would not go well? Like, why did he make that move?
I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that come out of Ukraine. I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, he was always a narcissist, and he always had an outsized ego. He built kind of within his companies, within Wagner, his own miniature kind of Putin system where he was Putin, and his entourage, kind of the guys who managed to stay around Prigozhin over time tended to be the guys who would tell him what he wanted to hear, right? And so I think he got, first of all, a false sense of his own worth and to what extent he was replaceable or irreplaceable. But also, I mean, he in Ukraine initially, the Ministry of Defense tried to not use Wagner. They for the initial invasion in February 2022, they wanted to kind of just use the Russian military and their own kind of volunteer battalions that they themselves had raised, because Prigozhin is such an abrasive, kind of annoying stone in the shoe for a lot of those top generals. And they felt at the time that the invasion and the occupation would be a relatively quick operation, that Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms.
Mm-hmm.
And it obviously very quickly it became clear that that would not be the case, and they ultimately had to turn to Prigozhin, who comes in again like a bear in a china shop, and what he was good at was taking tremendous personal risk that other people in Putin's Russia were not, didn't really have the balls to take. And so, but he was always operating sort of outside of the rules. And so Prigozhin comes in, his guys start getting kind of a number of victories, and he gets the wink and the nod from Putin's presidential administration to recruit convicts for the front. And so Prigozhin himself, which is again, I think not something that you would see from the other Russian elite around Putin. You would not see this from Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. Prigozhin very often himself goes to each of the Russian prisons and offers, they bring all the prisoners out into the yard, and he gets, he comes in a helicopter, he lands, he goes in front of, he can speak their language. He was, obviously a convict himself. And he offers, the deal, which is fight for me for 6 months, and if you survive, you go free with your criminal record expunged. And
Wow, so that's the deal, huh?
that's the deal.
That's the deal on the table.
And he's very honest too. He says, look, my losses are worse than Stalingrad. Like, a lot of you are going to go home in a wooden box, but if you survive,
You're free.
You're free.
Wow.
And ultimately, about 50,000 convicts sign up for it. So he builds this convict army that actually succeeds ultimately in taking a major city, Bakhmut, from a NATO-backed Ukrainian force. I mean, it's nothing to shake a stick at, but I mean, the way that he does it is by just the old human wave tactics of the Soviet period. And so
what's that? What is the human wave tactics?
The human wave is essentially, let's say Ukrainians are in a trench, the Wagner would send out 10 convicts. 8 of them don't even make it to the Ukrainian trench. 2 jump in, they maybe kill, one guy. The Ukrainians kill the other, those 2 guys. They're exhausted, and then another wave of Russians comes over again, and it's just relentless. And I was there in Bakhmut. I talked to the Ukrainians, and I talked to the Russians on the other side too. But it's effective, but it's not if you have an unlimited supply of men, and which Prigozhin did at the time. But again, his success, the way Putin's Russia works, is his success is ultimately someone else's failure, right? And so he is making these tremendously huge promises that he's going to take Bakhmut, that, he's the guy on the front line. He's filming himself on the front line. He's on Russian state TV. His ego reaches like sort of new heights. He considers himself to be sort of Russia's, not just like Russia's savior, but kind of the, as the Ministry of Defense starts shutting him out, so they take over the convict recruitment program, which takes away his means of victory. He starts arguing that they're taking away sort of some of his ammunition as well. He's sort of starting to kind of write checks that he can't, quite cash, and so kind of as he's getting shut out kind of more formally by the Russian elite, he starts turning this kind of populist route where he and Wagner are like the real Russians on the front, laying down their lives, in their mind, against Ukrainian fascism and the West, whereas these Ministry of Defense generals are, sitting, in Moscow in their mahogany offices, just kind of, carelessly throwing these men, away. And because he's a narcissist, I mean, I think he believes some of that too. He starts to come to believe some of that rhetoric. And so ultimately, when the Ministry of Defense decides that all Russian contractors fighting on the front have to sign a contract directly with the Ministry of Defense, essentially this was a move to take his Prigozhin's men away from him. And I think at that point in his mind, he understood that, having these 50,000 guys is what made him political. And if he lost those guys, his enemies would ultimately be able to do with him what they wanted. And so I think in his mind, I think it was sort of, it was a way, being shut out from access to Putin, to kind of create a situation where Putin would be forced to choose between him and his enemies. And he decided, in classic kind of gangster fashion, that he would make the choice easier for Prigozhin by just killing his enemies as well. And that is kind of what he tried to do. But also at that point too, I don't think he was constitutionally capable of just kind of like retiring to a log cabin in Siberia. There are some people that, like, once they're in the limelight, they cannot survive without it. And so it sort of, there was no world in which he could be told to just kind of quietly go his own way at that point. It just wasn't going to happen.
So what did he exactly do? What was his move? What did he exactly do that got him? Because I think I definitely wasn't close enough to this to understand what was actually happening. So what did he ultimately do?
I mean, he took his guys, and they moved from eastern Ukraine. They crossed back into southern Russia. They took over the southern Russian military command, and with the goal of finding Sergei Shoigu and another Russian general, Valery Gerasimov. And when Shoigu and Gerasimov had caught word of it and escaped, but Wagner had surrounded the military headquarters. They took it over, and then a number of kind of Russian generals who were there tried to talk Prigozhin down. They couldn't. and Prigozhin decided that he was going to start this, march for justice on Moscow, and so they started just heading up the highway to Moscow,
Mm.
and I think at some point, they're sort of just going into empty space, and I think. Uh, I mean, they did shoot down like a few Russian helicopters and planes, but I mean, they weren't getting incredible resistance, and it started becoming clear that um, even if this wasn't designed as a coup against Putin, he's sort of creating. It's becoming one, right? There's no way that he can enter Moscow in a way that is not so violent and destabilizing that it could ultimately also overthrow the regime itself.
Well, and
He's
and
he's
also
looking. Yeah, go ahead.
you'd have to imagine that. I mean, didn't I'm sure NATO or whatever or whoever the countries that are sort of backing Ukraine, weren't they probably totally in support of this like potential rift, this potential coup? Do you think they were actually giving him any support?
No, I don't think so. I think they knew something was up just from monitoring movements on satellite earlier.
I see.
But I think they might have even I don't know if they sent a warning or not, but we do know that they were wondering and they did not know who would be worse in terms of Putin or
Mm,
Prigozhin, and I
I
think
see.
um, it would have been. I think they. My guess is that they actually probably, if they went over the channels, it would have been to say we have nothing to do with this.
Mm, I see.
Um,
Okay.
because it was kind of for a little bit at that level of the destabilization. But which is what Prigozhin also realized. And again, he wasn't looking to overthrow the regime, he was trying to establish a new place within it.
Mm,
And
hmm.
I think as it became clear that he was in danger of doing just that, he called off the march.
Mm, hmm.
Uh, but he continued, I think, to think because he also like survived for a number of months. I think he did think that he was sort of irreplaceable. That like what
Mm.
he and Wagner had done was so important to the state that they couldn't just get rid of him like that. And ultimately, he was obviously wrong.
Yeah. So because Putin decided that it was too much of a threat, pretty much.
Putin, I mean, there are all sorts of. We can't pretend uh, to know exactly kind of how this went down, but there are kind of a number of narratives. One of which is that he still could have gone the exile route. He could have done the retire, never show face again route, and maybe have survived for a while. I mean, you look at like you know kind of the more liberal opposition to Putin, who were considered a threat, guys like Alexander Navalny. I mean, they were a stone in the shoe, and I mean, for like well over a decade. It took like a decade before they were eventually killed. So, it I think a lot of people were expecting like this the next day, like he's done, but like you can't. That's not really how the state would work in the for any reason, but there is one account that seems like it could be credible, that Putin basically sat down Prigozhin and the top Wagner commanders and basically said, uh, you guys, Wagner is now, part of the Ministry of Defense, like it's now a Russian government thing. And he was like, do you guys agree? And all the Wagner commanders are like, yes, we fucking agree. And Prigozhin just goes, no.
Mm.
Putin reportedly goes like, you're fucking crazy. Zhenya is the short, the diminutive for Yevgeny. He said, you're fucking insane. And he was. And I think we know, at least outwardly, right, that in the lead up to his death, he was running all over the place trying to be, seen in the Central African Republic, in Mali, as sort of the head of the operation, still moving around Belarus, trying to do everything to like kind of keep his empire going. And so I think, I don't think he was an idiot. I don't think that he like had in the back, I'm sure he knew in the back of his mind that his assassination was always a possibility, but I think he also thought he could somehow outrun it in a way too, or that he was also important enough. He just had to prove why he was important enough that they couldn't punish him.
Wow. So he is then, what actually ends up happening to him?
In August 2023, Dmitry Utkin, number of other Russian guys get on Prigozhin's private jet from Moscow to go to St. Petersburg, and it explodes in the middle of the air, and everyone comes crashing down to earth.
Wow. And so now, who runs Wagner now?
I mean, it depends on. Already by that point they were out of Ukraine. So, the guys who wanted to keep fighting in Ukraine could sign new contracts with another entity and go about it that way. The real question was about what to do with Wagner's operations in Africa. And in some places, it was easier for the state to take over Wagner's operations than in others. And so, in Libya, Wagner had maybe like 1,500 guys, but
wow,
there had been a ceasefire since October 2020 between the two main factions, in Tripoli and then in Benghazi, and so it was relatively easy for the Ministry of Defense, the MOD, to show up and say, hey, sign this. You guys are now Africa Corps, which was the alternative that was kind of created for this. But in other places, it was much more difficult, like in the Central African Republic. This was a place that was important to Prigozhin, but it wasn't important to the Russian state itself. And because of that, Prigozhin was able to kind of go out and try all sorts of like projects that you didn't see in other places. And so Wagner was, they offered, they were advisors they still are, to the Central African president. They were diplomats at first. They brought together the government and 14 armed groups into an internationally recognized peace agreement. When that peace agreement broke, they launched a counteroffensive against the armed groups that tried to take Bangui. And so they were also running a counterinsurgency. Then they were operating like a brewery, a vodka distillery, log mining, gold, timber, all sorts of things. And so when the Ministry of Defense showed up, these are a bunch of dudes who are career officers, right? They're not interested in like running a brewery, right? They're like, and so they show up and they're kind of like, if it's not broke, like let's not try to fix this, right? And so they largely kept the same people in place. I'm sure some account numbers for the transfers of that probably changed around. New people got paid maybe from whatever they were making, but things kind of have largely stayed the same. In Mali, it was really tough because you had about 1,500 Wagner guys out in central and northern Mali fighting against jihadists and separatists who are much better equipped than in the Central African Republic.
And so the contract there is with the government of Mali.
Correct.
And they are paying Wagner to basically do missions against, it's like Islamists, it's like ISIS or jihadists. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And so it was much more difficult. I mean, it was the same in the Central African Republic. The agreement was with the Central African government to provide security, and they were getting paid, through the enterprises that they had set up, and then also paid by the Central African government. But it's unlikely they were getting a lot of payment from the Russian government to be there. In some places they were paid by the Russian government, in Ukraine.
In
right?
Ukraine, yeah.
And to probably to a good extent in Syria, although Prigozhin tried to figure out other ways to make money there too, outside of just making money from the Russian government. But yeah, in Africa, it was much more sort of this independent model, which the Russian government was happy with him doing, right? Because he's planting a flag, making everyone feel good about the return of Russia as this great power. And again, we come back to the limited budget, right? It's not hitting. I mean, we would say the taxpayer, but it's not hitting the kind of the elite and the Russian state budget. And so if he can find a way to make it financially work, if it's not a massive headache in terms of foreign policy to the Russian government, he can do kind of what he wants to do out there. It's sort of a Francis Drake model, right? Where you go, you show up in a new place, you plant the flag, and you're like, I declare this, in the name of King James or whatever. And then your hope is that King James is then like so excited about it that he sends you a bunch of money and rewards you financially for it. So you take the initial risk, but you're expecting a payout in some sort of form. So that meant then that the Russian state now had to take over these things in Africa, which it wasn't exactly like always super excited to do. And they had all of these very real logistical constraints with the war in Ukraine too. And so in Mali, you got this sort of kind of half handover that has gone really poorly, and they've Wagner has only just kind of officially declared that its mission in Mali is over in favor of this new Ministry of Defense subordinate Africa Corps.
So did you spend time on the Russian front with Wagner?
Not on the Russian side, no.
Okay.
Especially after the whole thing in Mali, I think my wife would have killed me. But
yeah.
But I've interviewed a lot of guys, Russians, who have obviously fought on that side.
So what's your take on that situation? What are the the balancing weights. I've heard so many different things from so many different people about who really, they want the war to continue, they don't. What's your take on the Ukraine war?
Um, I think that they look. I mean, the economy has changed, has shifted in order to account for this. So Russia's in a wartime economy. Um, Inevitably, a lot of people are making money, um, but I think uh, that there there is an openness to the idea of negotiations, but um, Russia thinks right now that it is winning. They're not actually wrong about it right now, and and so they believe that they can hold out longer to get what they want out of the negotiations, which is essentially a a neutral Ukraine, preferably with a sort of pro-Russian head of state, or at the very least not Zelensky. Um, that there's a recognition of their territorial acquisition, that there's a recognition of their sovereignty over Crimea. I mean, still all of these things that are just politically untenable in Kiev, and so yeah, I mean, I think that they are willing to negotiate for sure, but the bid offer between the two is so wide right now that they feel like they can keep going until they get what they want. But there are, there are plans in place for the end of the war, and one of the things that they already are thinking about is, um, what the hell are we going to do with these hundreds of thousands of mobilized Russian soldiers, right, who are potentially going to be returning home from the front? Um, and that's a big problem. There are there are some guys who cannot like return to society, and they need to figure out what to do with those guys. There are guys that it would be preferable that they don't. And so, are there going to be sort of these new kind of PMC structures that you see popping up in Africa as sort of a funnel for these guys? It's going to happen on the Ukrainian side too. And then there are the guys that can, return home. And, also, how do you, if they don't get exactly everything that they need, what kind of narrative can they frame that will basically declare victory no matter what? So I think that they are uh, thinking of what an end would look like, but I think it's tough to say that they are, and they have the same fears that the Ukrainian side has, and they're not wrong. Like they believe that a full ceasefire right now would be an opportunity for Ukraine to rearm. I mean, I can't fault them on that logic. I think, and so there's, I think ironically, Ukraine, if there was a ceasefire, Ukraine might end up getting like so much more equipment than it would be able to get with the war currently ongoing, with the idea that they can kind of like freeze the line. And so uh, you see also kind of the opinion that they have to keep pushing this time around because their ability to mobilize again in 5 years, in 10 years time, is going to be like much diminished. Um, and so they have their own version of like, we can't just kick the can down the road, because we won't be able to do this again.
So, okay. So it seems like it's kind of in a how long do you give it before it's wrapped up?
2 years.
2 years, and you think there'll be some kind of agreement?
Maybe, but I mean, lots of weird things happen too. In the meantime, I mean, it's just look at Syria, right? If war lasts for long enough, you know, things start to get a little bit weird, and so I wouldn't be surprised. I think the thing that folks really need to pay attention to over the next year, over the next 2 years, would be Ukrainian domestic politics, right? Um, just because just because a bunch of people say there should be a ceasefire, does not mean that you can have a ceasefire, right? And so, the question will become, how would you, even if Zelensky and Putin tomorrow were like, oh, okay, you know what, enough is enough, like, let's have a ceasefire, neither of them would be able to enforce it, because this is an incredibly long front line of contact. And I mean, as you know, like, front is not like this kind of like fixed thing. It's sort of these various kind of degrees from the zero line, where Russians and Ukrainians are uh, you know uh, engaging each other, um, and you have hundreds of thousands of non-professional mobilized men and women who are engaging each other along the front. So you can't just say ceasefire and then expect, poor, John in the trench, who's looking at another Russian over there, like, to not engage, right? And because people are, so there, if there's no enforcement mechanism, it would be very difficult to get this thing somehow to stop. And that's even, and I don't think they can even, like, who is going to go in there and be the buffer between the Russians and the Ukrainians? I mean, it can't be a NATO country, because that'll trigger, some sort of potential response, right? Is China going to go in? That might be anathema to others for all sorts of. Are the Brazilians going to do it? That's, who's going to sign up to do that? That needs to be done so that the conflict doesn't keep, going, because each side is going to claim that the other is violating the ceasefire, right? And they'll both be right.
Yeah.
And then that's just disbarring kind of the internal politics of ceasefire and no ceasefire, and all the weird things that can happen coming out of that too.
Okay. Well, so very interesting. Very good to get you're untangling a lot of, I think most people have a very black and white view of this stuff, but it's obviously extremely complicated. So the book itself, how's it going? How, are you touring around? What's your process are you marketing the book? Like, not at all.
Yeah. It's I mean, this book is 5 years of
Yeah.
5 years of heart and soul poured into it. So definitely trying to market it, going on, shows like yours. We did a little bit of going around to bookstores, and I'm based in DC. It's a good place to be writing a book like this. Did a little stuff in New York and Boston, where I'm from originally. But yeah, no, the book's been selling well so far. Seems like it's been getting good reviews, and so which is good enough for my hope, which is just to be someone who gets to write books, throughout their life, and so thinking about already the next one, and I
Are you
think
going to
this.
stick with? Are you going to go do like the Blackwater? Are you going to do the American private military now that you've done the Russian one?
I think I might. Yeah, I think I
Ah,
might.
cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I just
I was just
saw.
I was just in I was just in Haiti
Oh wow.
with some of Eric Prince's guys. So I'll have an article coming out in Harper's magazine at some point about that.
What was
Um,
that like? What did you see in Haiti? I've heard Haiti is Haiti even worse than Africa?
oh, but yeah, I mean, I was in Port-au-Prince, and there you actually hear. I mean, there were like 50 calibers going the whole time. The gangs control probably 85% of the city now. They control the international airport, so the only way you can get in is by helicopter landing uh, on the lawn of a hotel. Um,
Wow.
and yeah, Eric has a team there that's like advising on drone operations against the gangs, which has actually been fairly effective so far. And
What are the gangs? Like what are the gangs? Are there just
I mean, they are. I mean, this current iteration is kind of what you would think of. I mean, there's not, some of them are like a little bit more politically oriented, but in reality, I mean, it's like literally like street gangs that make their money by taxing the homes and businesses and under their territory by uh, they make a lot of money by as a through the Colombian cartels
mm,
for shipping drugs further north. Um, that's what the most powerful gangs are, the ones that are working with the Colombians.
mm.
Any type of trafficking, any type of yeah, and they they with a portion of that money they buy AR-15s from here in the United States and are often better equipped than the Haitian police force. So,
Wow. What's
over
it
time,
like for you on the ground there? What was your day-to-day life like in Haiti?
you come in there. I didn't go into gang territory because I didn't have the time to negotiate it, uh, and because of the drones, they're actually kind of much more underground and much more wary and things along those lines. So there's really just 10% of the city that you can go around in. The other 90% is controlled by gangs, and they're fighting with the police or against each other, and so you just hear the gunfire all day long.
That's crazy.
um, but yeah, you just go around, you interview people in the government. There's that 10% is still relatively safe, but you have to go around in like you can't walk around by yourself. For sure, because there's still kidnap risk and all that good stuff. So
Wow.
security, yeah.
It's really crazy. But okay, so yeah, I just actually saw Eric Prince at this thing in Detroit I was at a couple days ago. This
Oh yeah.
reindustrialized conference. Yeah.
Oh, I think I just saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Someone was speaking at that. I can't remember who. Yeah. How was that?
Um, it was cool. It was, it was interesting. It was, yeah, there was protesters out front, which was funny.
Next to reindustrializing.
Well, they just think everything is Palantir and Palantir is killing Gaza. That's their opinion. So yeah, it was interesting though. Yeah, he was there. All the Palmer Luckey showed up as a robot. There was a Palmer Luckey robot, a remote Palmer Luckey, which was pretty funny. Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty. Yeah, I like the idea of reindustrializing. I think there's a lot of cool business going on with that. And yeah, Eric Prince, I guess, has become sort of a voice in that scene, um, which is cool. Okay, so the next one's going to be all right. So this Harper's piece is about Haiti, the Eric Prince guys in Haiti.
Yes, sir. Hopefully, it'll come out in the fall.
Yeah, and that could be a chapter in a book, maybe.
Could be. Hopefully. Maybe.
Maybe one day.
Maybe one day.
Okay, cool, man. Well, I think that's a good point to wrap up here. So, where can people find you? You said you're a Luddite, so you're not on Twitter all day, I'm guessing.
No, unfortunately, like all writers, I'm basically on Twitter all day. So you can find me on John Lechner 1 is my Twitter handle.
Nice.
And yeah, that's probably the one I frequent the most. But also, if you want to write an email, johnlechnerauthor.com. And the book itself is available wherever books are sold. So
Yeah, Death is Our Business. It's a funny title. It's good.
Yeah.
All right, dude. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me. And yeah, I will post this episode shortly. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. It was a great talk.
Cool, for sure.
Cool.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.